Welcome to the Workology Podcast, a podcast for the disruptive workplace leader. Join host Jessica Miller-Merrill, founder of Workology.com, as she sits down and gets to the bottom of trends, tools, and case studies for the business leader, HR, and recruiting professional who is tired of the status quo. Now here's Jessica with this episode of Workology.
Welcome to the Workology Podcast, sponsored by Upskill HR and Ace the HR Exam. Workplace bullying is on the rise. While statistics vary, some studies reveal that nearly all of American workers have been affected by workplace bullying as a target or a witness to abusive behavior against a coworker. It creates a toxic work environment, leads to high employee turnover rates and costs. It costs companies billions of dollars each year. Today, I'm joined by Mattice Zundel. She's a strategic HR consultant and coach and trainer who partners with clients to replace toxic workplace behaviors and cultures with positive, respectful ones. She founded Civility Partners in 2008 as a result of working in her own toxic environment, not her herself, but experienced bullying. She's written 3 books, one of which Ken Blanchard called the most comprehensive and valuable handbook on the topic of workplace bullying. Catherine is active in the International Association for Workplace Bullying and Harassment and is one of the 4 founding members of the National Workplace Bullying Coalition, a nonprofit organization focused on ending workplace bullying. Catherine, welcome to the Workology Podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Let's start with your background. I talked about how you founded Civility Partners because you had worked in a toxic environment. Can you tell us more about that?
Sure. I was the director of human resources at an organization, and there was another director there who definitely engaged in toxic behavior. I would consider it bullying behavior. He was an uber micromanager, even over people like me who did not report to him. I thought he was insubordinate to the president of the organization. He definitely had lots of turnover in his department, and it did create a toxic environment for me as the director of HR because I found myself stepping in constantly and ended up being the buffer for, his behavior and how he was treating everyone else. I spent a lot of time talking to the president about his behavior and, hey, president, could you address it, and the president, I think, was fairly conflict avoidant and would not, and tell me things like, that's just how he is, don't let it bother you. And so I was managing this as an HR professional, but then also felt attacked by him. So I've also experienced bullying as a target, and between just kind of being caught in the middle of it all, it definitely was pretty exhausting and definitely affected my work product and quality of work and all of that. And during that time, though, I mustered up enough energy to start getting a master's degree and ended up doing all of my academic research in grad school on workplace bullying. So I joke that I have a master's degree in workplace bullying.
Isn't that so interesting how bad managers, you can turn a bad experience into a really good one, and that now you're helping others navigate through similar types of situations with similar types of people that you experience. I love that.
Thank you. Thank you.
I know there isn't a single answer from a legal perspective, but can you describe for us what workplace bullying is?
Sure. So often it is stated that it's the lower level form of harassment, and then HR, I hate this phrase, it doesn't rise to the level of harassment. Actually, harassment and bullying are the same exact behaviors. If you read the definition of harassment on the EEOC's website, for example, it describes bullying, that it feels like a condition of employment, and that a reasonable person would consider it intimidating, hostile, and abusive. So the only difference really is that if it's equal opportunity bullying, then that's essentially legal. But if it's bullying aimed at somebody due to their protected characteristic, then we call that harassment, and it is illegal. So that's the simple answer. But I'll give a little bit more. the research is very clear that workplace bullying is about a psychological power imbalance, that again, it's abusive and it's creating this intimidating and hostile environment. It definitely has to be repeated and pervasive, just like with harassment. We're not talking about somebody was rude and now we're all saying you're a bully. We're talking about ongoing behavior. And ultimately, it causes a lot of psychological and physical harm to individuals as they're depressed and burnt out. And actually, the research is very clear that you can develop PTSD from being bullied. And I'll add to my very long answer. I do want to share what I find is there are 3 buckets of bullying behavior. And this helps with this argument where we just hear a lot of legislatures who are looking at laws around bullying, for example, that they don't want to regulate something like incivility. And so this can help with that conversation. And as HR is speaking to leaders, it's not about a rude comment. So the 3 buckets of bullying behavior are aggressive communication, doing things like sending off nasty emails, yelling, aggressive body language, like a puffed up chest. So it's, aggressive communication that we can all look at and agree it's aggressive. The second bucket is humiliation. So teasing, spreading rumors, blaming others for problems that maybe are out of their control. And the third bucket is manipulation. So removing tasks that are important to someone's job without an explanation, giving unmanageable workloads, hiding tools or things that somebody needs to do their job well. So bottom line is that what I usually see is we don't call someone a bully if they're a yeller, if they're only engaging in one bucket of the behavior. We tend to call people bullies when we're seeing all 3 of those buckets. So hopefully that helps clarify if you ever have to do an investigation around bullying or something, to really look for those 3 buckets: aggressive communication, humiliation, and manipulation.
I feel like you'd explained every WWE show I've ever seen, but workplace style. Not that I've watched a lot of WWE, but I just am picturing those guys doing all the puffed up chest stuff and all the crazy things that they do. So
Yep.
I have often said, my career was defined by bad managers. I learned exactly what I did not want to do as a leader manager, and you have turned this into an entire business, which is fantastic.
Thank you. Yeah, sometimes it takes experiencing all of the things you don't want in order to know what you do want, or what you don't want to be.
Agreed. That's why I had a starter husband. So
I just heard that yesterday too. Someone said something like that to me.
I learned what I didn't want. So let's talk about some of the services that you offer through Civility Partners, because I think that people are like, okay, you're helping with workplace bullying. What do you do? How do you help companies and individuals through this?
Yep. So there's 2 main things that we do. We also do training, but training doesn't solve problems. So the 2 things we do that do solve the problem of bullying. One is I specialize in executive and leadership coaching, specifically for aggressive, abrasive, too assertive leaders. So leaders who are engaging in bullying behavior, I coach those individuals and help turn them around. And then Civility Partners also does a lot of work in toxic work environments where, there's a culture of bullying or harassment or discrimination. So we'll do a climate assessment or employee survey, and then we really work with the leaders and the employees to create plans to turn that environment around. So those are kind of the 2 main ways that I'm turning around toxic environments.
I love that. Let's talk about the uncertain economy, though. I feel like right now, with the current climate that we're in, where a lot of things are in flux, a lot of change is happening. We've been in this crazy world that we're living and working in for over a year now. Does this create the perfect storm for workplace bullying, you think?
It does indeed, for a lot of reasons. The research is super clear around bullying that, the organizational climate absolutely facilitates it. So for example, a high stress environment an environment where people are working on their own or alone. This is all sounding like our Zoom environment right now, right? And because of COVID, so we have a lot of stressed out people who are working in an environment where they're sort of lonely. They could easily be bullied during a one-on-one Zoom meeting rather, versus in the office where other people might hear that bullying taking place. Now it's in an isolated way. And certainly people are all striving to appear as competent and capable as they can possibly appear right now, because if there's any future layoffs or problems in the organization as a aftermath of COVID, people want to make sure they're not on the layoff list. So I think while people already pre-COVID struggled to report things like bullying and harassment, I think they will be even less inclined to report it now because they don't want to be seen as a weak link. So yes, we are in a perfect storm for aggressive behavior.
Or they're worried about keeping their job. Like, this could be the one thing that puts my boss, depending upon who the bully is, over the edge and decides that I'm not an important part of the future of the organization.
Exactly.
Let's take a reset. This is Jessica Miller Merrill, and you are listening to the Workology podcast, sponsored by Upskill HR and ACE the HR exam. Today, we're talking about workplace bullying and toxic workplaces with Catherine Mattice Zundel. Personal and professional development is essential for successful HR leaders. Join Upskill HR to access live training, community, and over 100 on-demand courses for the dynamic leader. HR Restart credits available. Visit upskillhr.com for more. We tend to think about people who are bullies in kind of a stereotypical way. I think about some shows of bullies and movies and things like that. But I wanted to ask you, you've done a lot of research in this area. Obviously, you're coaching and training. Who are the bullies in the workplace? Who are you seeing? What job titles? Are they lower level employees? Are they all senior leaders? Who are these folks?
Yeah, so the people that I coach are generally pretty high up in the organization because coaching, has a price tag versus a lower level individual is more easily let go or performance managed, right, in terms of their behavior. So what I do know about people who engage in bullying is they are extraordinarily focused on competence. They want to be seen as the most competent person there ever was. And in fact, they actually live in a world of anxiety around that being seen as competent. And so that's why they're seen as so valuable to the organization. So that's the other piece of it. People who engage in bullying are often seen as very valuable to the organization because they bring in a lot of money, or they have a lot of industry knowledge, or both, or they've been in the organization for a long time. And so all of that high success and high value that they bring to the organization is actually driven by this fear of looking incompetent. So while we often think of people who bully as these psychopaths, raging and yelling, I kind of joke they're my delicate flowers, or they're like glass because they're easily broken. And that's what drives the bullying behavior. So they're living in this hyper anxiety around being seen as competent and successful and valuable. And when they perceive that as being threatened, that's when the bullying comes out. So just to give you an example, one individual I coached, he reported directly to the owner of a very large organization. And, he had really come up in his career, and this organization had actually headhunted him and brought him over. And when he saw that people made mistakes, and this was a government type of an agency, he would pull out the law and start reading it in a very aggressive way and sort of yelling and really getting focused on the details. Well, where all of that is coming from is this fear of, you who made the mistake, you're making me look bad, you're making the team look bad. And so he was reacting to that with this fight, right? I'm talking about fight or flight. And that was, one of many bullying behaviors that he engaged in, was to really get after people with this, here's the rule book, why didn't you read it? Kind of a putting you down because you don't know as much as I do type of a thing. So, they're not these vicious psychopaths that people often portray them as.
Is there one sex more than the other that tends to be a bully in your experience? Or do we see bullies in both men and women?
I've seen research that said that it's more often men. It was something like 60-40 for men. And I've also read research that when the bully is a woman, she tends to go after other women. In my experience as a coach, it has been more men that I've coached. There has been a fair share of women though as well. But I haven't necessarily seen this thing around, that women are only picking on other women. But yeah, so it seems that there's maybe more males engaging in bullying, but it's not, 90% versus 10% kind of a thing.
So we're talking about bullies and men or women, these folks that you're working with as an executive coach for bullies, which I think is such a great service that you're providing. But I wondered, as am thinking about the bullies that I encountered in my workplace, do they know that they're bullies and that they're toxic? And what does your coaching programs look like for different workplace bullies?
Sure. So what I've learned is that they often recognize people see them as a difficult manager or a hard manager. And sometimes I've seen where it's almost a badge of honor. I'm just holding them accountable and that's just how I manage. What they don't recognize is the real impact that behavior has. So they often see themselves as I'm a hard manager. I'm just making people successful, but not recognizing that people are actually quitting because of them or leaving or going home and crying to their spouse. So the other piece of this is they do, of course, lack social and emotional intelligence. If they had it, they wouldn't engage in that behavior. So while a lot of coaches may go in trying to convince people to have empathy or try to teach them social and emotional intelligence, that's not necessarily my process. I'm not going to all of a sudden make them care about people's emotions. And in fact, they often feel like emotions are useless. We're not emotional at work. I don't care how you feel about it. It needs to be done, kind of a thing. So the process that I use is actually created by a woman whose name is Dr. Laura Crawshaw. And she had been coaching individuals for a long time and figured out that she was actually really good at coaching these aggressive or abrasive leaders. And so she really honed in on that and over time developed this process that she is now teaching those of us who are interested in learning about it. And so I use her process and I do find that it works. And so she had figured out, I can't teach them empathy necessarily. They don't care about that so much. And I want to caveat that, again, they're not psychopaths. It's not like they go around not caring about how people feel. What they're focused on is the job and getting the job done, and then emotions sort of come second. And so the process is to meet with the individual, explain the process, and then ask them, essentially, what do you know about why I'm here? What have you been told by HR? What are we working on here? And they often don't really understand. They're even confused that here all of a sudden they're being sort of forced into coaching. And so I'll say, well, why don't we do a little research? Because I don't really know much either. I don't work here, so let me interview some people. And so I interview people whose names they gave me and just ask a lot of questions around their communication and leadership style. And then I'm able to present feedback to the individual. So I take all my interview notes and I move them all into themes so that it's digestible. And so that document really is that's where the turning point happens. So now it's not just HR saying, well, people are telling me this, it's not hearsay anymore. These are the words of the people you told me to interview. And so, for example, one theme might be that they shame people in public. So then, well, let's understand that theme, and we can read through the 15 or 20 bullet points that are their coworkers' words that demonstrate that. And what I find often is there is some level of defensiveness in that meeting. Of course, who would want a 20-page document about all of their faults? So that's to be expected. But they also are pretty hurt and appalled that this is how they're seen. So then I'm back to that, they know they're seen as hard, but they just don't understand the extent of the damage. And that feedback really shows it to them. And going back to the question about gender, women often cry in that meeting because they're so upset by how they're perceived. And usually on the next call, after I've read through the feedback, they're ready to change, and they'll say things like, all right, I've taken it in. I get it. If 15 people said this, then it must be true. What do we do? Can you help me? And so then we go through coaching.
So powerful. I'm thinking about bullies of my past that I have worked with, and just their kind of how they are and their reaction and getting defensive. Like, they don't get a lot of honest feedback about their behaviors. So this might be the first time that they've ever gotten real honest feedback, and then it's coming from somebody like you who's a neutral third party.
Exactly.
And you're sharing this. So wow. Everybody wants to know, I think, how they're perceived, but they're not stepping outside themselves to watch it on the movie screen. They're inside the moment in their own kind of personal position, not the meta position. So that's really powerful.
Yeah, it is. It is. And I'll just add too, a lot of times these people are very focused on the success of the organization and their team, which is ironic. So a lot of this feedback is about their passion. So again, they're, caught up in this world of like, we can't make mistakes. We all need to be as competent as possible because the organization depends on it. And so that I'm able to kind of frame it that way too. It's like, look, you're passionate. That's what this is about. We just got to find some new ways for you to manage. But just to give you an example of that, one individual I coached was at a software company, and he was a golden goose. This individual created these ideas, and he had all these different teams of software engineers underneath him that he was executing his ideas with. And the company would then sell those tidbits of software to the Googles and Microsofts and large organizations of the world. And we were talking once about his really getting after people for mistakes. And he said, my boss tells me that the 5,000 paychecks are all on my shoulders. That's, I take that to mean that we don't have room for error. So ironically, he was engaging in this behavior because he wanted to make sure everybody got a paycheck.
Do you feel like these bullies sometimes maybe are also perfectionists? Like, they have a really high level and high expectations that they expect from themselves, and it's carried through to the teams that they lead and manage?
That's exactly right. Yeah, they live in this world of, I have to be the most competent person in the room, and they expect everyone else lives in that world as well. And I do often find myself saying, and I got this from Dr. Crashaw, you're not the competence crusader, you are an educator. If someone makes a mistake, then help them learn. Don't beat them down for doing something that you perceive as incompetent. So yeah, absolutely. They are perfectionists, and they hold everyone to this standard that they hold themselves to.
Which is sometimes really unrealistic.
Yeah.
Especially if they're putting in a lot of hours and they're an exempt level employee and their team is non-exempt or something like that.
Yep. Yeah.
Another area that I wanted to talk about and just kind of highlight here is that right now, during this crazy pandemic time, COVID-19, 2/3 of employees are reporting that they have poor mental health, and it's undercut their job performance. And 40% of employees are battling burnout. This comes from a survey by the mental health benefits provider, Lyra Health, and the National Alliance of Healthcare Purchaser Coalitions. I just wanted to point that out because I feel like with all of us working remotely and then all the uncertainty, everything is just heightened.
Mhm.
And I wanted to ask you, as the expert here, how should HR leaders and their and employees handle workplace bullying, especially when so many of us are working remotely? Does it change if we're working remote versus in person? And what does that look like, in your opinion?
I don't think the process changes, or the steps might be a little different in how they unfold, but bottom line is that workplace bullying is an organizational problem. And HR gets so focused on the individuals, right? For example, you get a complaint about harassment. What do? An investigation, which is focused on the people, the perpetrator and the target, and maybe some witnesses if there are any. But it's all focused in this little area and focused on the people. But again, the research is very clear that the organization itself actually creates a lot of opportunity for bad things to happen, like us being in a stressful environment. I'm not saying that's an excuse. What I'm saying is that HR has to recognize the organizational culture problems that might be causing this behavior and address those. That's just as important, if not more important, than addressing the one individual who's engaging in the behavior, or the few individuals engaging in the behavior. That said, and we could do a whole nother podcast about turning around a toxic culture, but that's a whole nother 8-hour conversation. But in terms of the individual who's engaging in the behavior, HR has to absolutely teach managers and supervisors how to address the lower level, seemingly minor incivility that happens on a regular basis. And certainly we're not micromanaging incivility. We've all had a rough day. We're all exhausted. But managers and supervisors need to understand that they should be stepping in and coaching that type of behavior early on, so that it doesn't escalate. It's a lot easier to solve it early. And then those people who are being coached to behave better as they rise to the ranks, they'll be, engaging in more positive behaviors. And then same goes for those abrasive leaders engaging in bullying, the C-suite folks, or the EVPs and VPs and directors. I know performance management is a little bit different in that realm, but they still need to be told this behavior is unacceptable, and they need to be told early on. The earlier it's brought up to their attention, the easier it is for them to change. So what I find with coaching is often this person's been engaging in this behavior for quite a long time. And although HR and perhaps the CEO have been sharing that, hey, you need to change, I'm hearing about this incident, you can't do that anymore. Overall, the person's being given permission to act that way because there's no real consequences around change, or if they don't change. So, I'm brought into this situation where something finally hit the fan and this person's lost and confused. Why am I all of a sudden being held accountable? I've been acting this way all this time. So it's not fair to the individual if you don't step in early. And again, organizations are afraid to, because this person's seen as so valuable. They're not going to just run because you give them some clear information about how to change and hold them accountable to it. If their goal is to be uber competent and be seen that way, help them be uber competent communicators and leaders. It's right in their wheelhouse.
Well, this is fantastic advice and information. I'm thinking about I think every person listening to this podcast has probably encountered a bully. They've been the target of one. And now as an HR leader, we are often the person who has to deliver that information, that feedback to that manager. So all helpful advice and insights that you've been sharing today to help us be able to I feel like confront's the wrong word, but just address these behaviors as quickly as possible so that we can help this person change, evolve, and grow.
Yeah. I'll give one other piece of advice. The script is really helpful here. So where HR, I think, gets caught up sometimes is you have an EVP, let's say, who's being accused of bullying, or people are complaining about the behavior. And then HR talks to the EVP and says, I'm hearing that yesterday in this meeting, you berated somebody, or you called out some mistakes that, should have been called out in a different scenario, or you made an inappropriate joke, and the person responds with, no, I didn't, or they're too sensitive, or, and there's all this justification and or denial when you focus on the facts of the situation, keeping in mind that they don't have a lot of social and emotional intelligence. They're not grasping what you're saying. So instead of getting focused on the facts, which is what we do, where, investigations and all that stuff, that's where HR goes. Instead, try saying, I'm hearing that people perceive your communication as too aggressive. And then when they come back with, no, it's not, they're being sensitive, it's not my fault, whatever it is, the response is, or they'll say, well, give me examples. What are the details? The response is, I don't know. I'm in HR. I'm not in your department. So I don't know all of the facts, but I do know one fact. And that one fact is that 5 people over the last 6 months have shared that they feel that your communication is too aggressive. And that one fact has to change. So the fact is that you're perceived this way, so don't get caught up in the facts of different scenarios, because they're going to argue with you. But to say that, this fact is I've got a series of complaints. That's what we need to address. That fact has to change. The complaints have to stop.
This is a great way to approach this individual and not get caught up in the nuances of the whole situation, but like you said, the perception. Well, Catherine, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us. I wanted to give you an opportunity to talk about where people can go to connect with you, to learn more about what you do at Civility Partners.
Sure. I'm at civilitypartners.com. Look me up on LinkedIn. I'm all over the place. Google me, send me a carrier pigeon, whatever. I'm all over the place. I'm easy to find, but Civility Partners is my website.
Awesome. Well, we'll link to all the things on the show notes of this over at workology.com. So thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us today. I think you've given us some really great resources and tools to be able to take action right away in our organizations.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Are you loving the Workology podcast? Our Workology community reaches over 600,000 HR leaders every single month. Want to be a sponsor? Reach out to us at workology.com/advertising. It's really important for HR leaders to be able to support employees who are being bullied at work and ensure that the workplace isn't a toxic one. While it might be surprising to some that bullying can continue into adulthood, we think of bullying happening when we're kids in school. Most people can identify with this experience and must be able to rely on HR to help remedy the situation. I appreciate Catherine for taking the time today to share her experience with us. Thank you for joining the Workology podcast, sponsored by Upskill HR and Ace the HR Exam. This podcast is for the disruptive workplace leader who's tired of the status quo. This is Jessica Miller-Merrill. Until next time, you can visit workology.com to listen to all our Workology podcast episodes.